Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us, and welcome once again to a Thursday teissTalk. We are thrilled to be here today. We have got four excellent panelists for you, where we will be talking about protecting your crown jewels as an SME without breaking the bank. Yes, we will be joined shortly. But in the meantime, before we start, let me just remind everybody about the teissTalk mug that is up for grabs. Should you post an interesting story or an interesting question or an interesting comment or something that makes us laugh, something that makes us cry, or even just makes us feel a little bit awkward. Um, Secondly, for our viewers on LinkedIn, welcome. I hope you enjoy the show. You won't be able to interact with us unless you join us at the teiss.co.uk website /teisstalk. Please either feel free to carry on being passive or join us in real time. I've just been told that once again my camera has stopped, but we will see what's going on there. I will fix that very shortly. But certainly right now, if I could ask onto stage, please, Stephen, JC, Steph, and Kev. Hello, Stephen.
Hi there.
Hello.
Good to have seen you briefly.
Yes, I know. I have no idea. Do you know what? This has been something that's been plaguing me for weeks. So we'll see. We'll see.
Oh, there you are.
That's not quite worked, has it? Let's have another try, shall we'll see. That might just have to do. Um, so hello, Stephen. Hello, JC. Welcome back.
Hello.
Uh,
Thank you.
Hello, Steph,
Hi.
and hello, Kev.
Hello. Hello, everyone.
So we're just about to start with the news item. Before we do that, we have got a little poll for you all. Since this is about small to medium enterprises, the question for our poll is, what size organization are you in currently? If we could just pop that up on the screen or just get that running, that would be great. There we go. Perfect. But let's take a look at the news item, shall we? Do you know what? I've got a lot of things to say about this. Thames Water's IT falling apart and is hit by cyber attacks. Sources claim. So we all know what sources mean. We're not entirely sure what that's going to come to. But my very first question is, of all the pictures of a Thames Water engineer, did they have to find the one where it looks like he soiled himself? And secondly, really, this doesn't surprise us. A lot of the UK's sort of core infrastructure services are like water. In fact, water's probably the in the zeitgeist at the moment, but like water, electricity, gas, etc., is woefully underfunded since being privatized. But we're not going there. But this really should come as no surprise to anybody, right?
I completely agree, Tom. I mean, it's when I read the article, I was amazed at the almost sensationalization of the situation and almost trying to make a story out of some fragments of other stories. But certainly we all understand the challenges that organizations, in CNI face, and also the challenge that they face with legacy systems. Um, I did chuckle about the presence of Lotus Notes still within the environment. So my
Yeah,
commiserations to anybody that
yeah.
actually works there and has to deal with notes, having
Because
used to work at IBM many years ago.
Well, and we all know that Lotus stands for lots of trouble, usually serious, right?
Exactly.
I mean, legacy IT in an environment like this it's not a great look. Let's be clear about that. But it's also totally unsurprising as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fair to say that they wouldn't be in any way in a unique situation. I mean, okay, while Thames Water have ended up on the cover of this story, so to speak. I mean, I think many organisations, if they go and look to themselves, will find that they have, to differing degrees, perhaps not all running Lotus Notes, but varying degrees of technology that is, well, perhaps already past end of life or even nearing that way. I mean, if we think about general organisations today, with Windows 10 sort of within the next year going to go end of life and lacking, therefore, ongoing security support, more than half of the Windows deployments in the UK, from what I've seen of latest stats, are Windows 10.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a fair proportion of Windows 11, and there's some deployments of older versions of Windows that went end of life some time ago. But to what degree, I wonder, are those organizations that are currently depending on Windows 10 actually prepared for changing that to something that will be actually maintained in the longer term?
And I dare say Windows 10 in these environments is the tip of the iceberg. But there's probably, I think the quote here, it's in the first paragraph, the software we use is older than me. Some of the hardware is older than my dad, says one of the team fighting a daily battle. Now that's not to disparage dads everywhere, but that's really rather old hardware, even in the best case scenario.
I mean, putting an optimistic spin on it, at least it's not as old as his granddad. So, there are some silver linings here. Right?
I think that article beautifully captures just how frustrated people are as well and what the culture is within because of the tech.
Yes, I think that's exactly it. They feel like they're fighting a losing battle.
That is very correct. I have, field experience. I have worked for various organizations where we had to do major upgrades or major transformational programs just to upgrade Lotus or hardwares or software that sometimes the organization did not even have the idea they have that software or hardware within the company. And when they find out, and it's a worry, but what is even more concerning is the dependency of the organization on those softwares and hardware without them knowing that they depend so much on those software. And usually sometimes takes at least 8 months if you work for a large organization, and sometimes multi-years for you to get away just from Lotus. So it is a really, really hard work depending on the organization you work for. And it's funny enough, I say funny, but it's funny to see the organization most of the time have no idea that they actually depend so much on those legacy software and hardwares.
Yeah. And finally, it says here that Thames declined to comment on the record about cyber attacks, but a source, and that word again, a source, has said that it had not experienced any cyber attacks, full stop. That sounds straight from the school of the implausible, right? Yeah. Surely, as a primary supplier of water in the UK, they would be subject to cyber attacks on a fairly regular basis.
I mean, they're almost certainly going to be facing some level of scanning attacks, and with the age of systems that they have in place, you're right, it would be implausible to think that there's not been a scenario or a situation where some form of adversary or maybe even some form of malicious insider has undertaken some activity, or there's been some form of operational situation that's caused them some challenges, let's say. I do think it raises an important question, though. We need to be in a position as an industry where we move away from the stigma associated with openly talking about cyber attacks, or trying to be in a position where we don't talk about cyber attacks, because there is an advantage and there is strength in us being able to share scenarios where an attack has happened, and being able to share with peers across the industry, and collectively raise our security posture and our defense. And probably the report that the British Library introduced several months ago after their well-publicized attack is a good example of being very open and transparent with what can happen when there is an attack on an organization.
I'd imagine what we're dealing with here is more semantics around what they're counting and defining an attack
Yeah.
to be. Maybe they've not had a significant breach, and that's perhaps more plausible. But I would agree with you, Tom and Kev, that the likelihood of there not being any attacks, scanning something that they will have experienced that they will want to know about and prevent from becoming anything else would be probable.
It sounds like a potted comment coming from somebody who really doesn't understand what's being asked or what is actually going on in the world, which is worrying. And I think to Kev's point about openness and transparency, it's funny how the industry has become more open to mental health, stress, burnout, etc., and how we're much more open about that, but we're still so closed about everything else that could actually help stop some of that mental health problems, stress, burnout, etc. We're definitely treating a symptom, not the cause here.
Yeah, just to add on that, I mean, it potentially is a knee-jerk reaction from internal comms that have not been fully briefed or understand the situation as well, which I think also just demonstrates, I guess, the culture from within around cyber attacks as well.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's move on to the panel proper, and hopefully we've got many responses in the poll. So in response to what would be my first question, which is, what is a small to medium enterprise? What is that classed as? So we've got here the 4 definitions of micro, small, medium, and large, and it's an interesting breakdown actually of between. Yeah, mostly large and some small. So that's interesting. But why is it important that we understand what the distinctions are of an SME?
Yeah, I think if you think about the SME organization, and in fact, on my way into work this morning, I was listening to the Today program on Radio 4, and they were talking about SME, and they were talking about SME being really the backbone of the UK industry, UK PLC. But if you think about even those definitions that we just saw on the screen, the requirements that an organization has that sits in the micro category is very different to the requirements that an organization would have in the medium category. It's not everybody is created equal in this regard. A 10-person music instrument retailer is very different to a rapidly growing 150-person fintech organization. So I think that characterization is broad, and perhaps we need to get into the detail of what each of these different areas need from a cybersecurity standpoint.
I think it's also a fundamental thing that, linked to that around the in-house knowledge and the resourcing that's likely to be there for cybersecurity. So at a certain point, as an organization grows, there's a stage at which they're more likely then to be outsourcing IT and perhaps cybersecurity provision. Below a certain size, they're likely to be doing it in-house or perhaps not doing it. And beyond a certain size, sort of in the mid-mediums, for example, then they're more likely to be bringing certain aspects back in-house as the organization becomes large enough to warrant having a dedicated IT and cyber team within it. So the way that cybersecurity gets handled is going to vary as they go through the different size profiles.
And understanding what, to the first point here about data assets and how to prioritize them. To your point, Kev, very different from a fintech to a small, music shop operation. Or is it? It's client information, right? It's personal information. It's payment card information potentially. Is whilst the boundaries are very broad, is it really that different when it comes down to basics?
I think the fundamentals and the basics of good cybersecurity hygiene remain true, whatever the organization is. I think the business challenges that the organization faces, differ. It's probably the case, generalization, but probably the case that a small retailer, to take my example and to take it further, probably lacks deep cybersecurity awareness and experience. But they're concentrating on their core mission, which in my scenario is basically selling musical instruments. Whilst they may have an awareness around some level of keeping the lights up, keeping the systems running, and in tech, they're not likely to be deeply technical, and their main concern is going to be basically turning a profit and making sure that they can continue to do business and operate.
Yeah.
So that's where I see a main difference between these different bands.
I mean, they're going to have different levels of recognition about sensitive data, what data they hold and its sensitivity. They're all going to be having some data that requires protection. They're all going to be having something that's business critical. But the extent to which they recognize that from a cybersecurity perspective, I think, is certainly going to differ. And depending again upon the sector of the business, I mean, you mentioned fintech. That's a more regulated sector, so there's going to be more overt expectations that they will realize around protecting things than, let's say, your musical instrument retailer again.
Yeah. So certainly when it comes to the small to medium enterprises, we're looking at different levels of information that they can draw on and sources of information. And the reason I say that is something that would be useful to a cybersecurity professional in your 150-person organization is not going to be useful to, Darren, the Saturday job worker in your music shop, without wishing to, be cruel or anything. But those two things are very, very different sources of information. I imagine the former is more available than the latter. Would that be true?
Probably in general terms, yeah, but I think that there's a lot of information that's available for different levels of, I suppose, maturity. One thing that we've done as part of a current research project here in Nottingham, in collaboration with others, has been looking at the availability of guidance, advice for SMEs. So if they were, for example, to do a general web search to try and enlighten themselves and do a search for SME cybersecurity advice, guidance, myriad different sources they will find, but then there's a significant variation in what cybersecurity topics actually get covered within those sources. At what level are they actually pitched in terms of the prior expectations around IT knowledge, cyber knowledge, and how far do they go? The depth of coverage, whether they're actually taking you through to actionable advice or really just raising awareness of there's a thing you need to do something about. Now you're more aware of it, but you're still not enabled, you're still not competent to deal with it for yourselves. So yeah, there's a lot that gets you past the first post, for example, but then it's how do you proceed beyond that, I think, a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And this is definitely a problem I see in the industry, which people are able to identify the resource, or when you share something with them, they are able to click on the link and read that resource. But what do we do after that? And most of the time, with more organizations, they do not understand what most of the guide is saying. They, of course, understand when there's no jargon, and they understand, yeah, we need to make sure our data is secure. We need to make sure we patch our system. But how on earth do we actually do this? And when we come to these questions, then they start to say, you know what, I'll just put this on the side and I will not worry about this until something actually happens. So yeah, it's a very hard question to answer, how we can really help, small organizations actually take actions, because most of the time they don't have sufficient resource on site to be able to deal with that problem, even when they have the guidance.
And finding guidance.
At one level, it gives them the vocabulary and some of the baseline understanding to have the dialogue with somebody else. So they're perhaps at least one step further along the line. But yeah, exactly as you say, it still doesn't solve the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah. I do think that the UK government, NCSC, they've sought to try and provide some level of guidance and instruction to organizations that are in the SME space, or in that, that very micro space, to organizations, and they've tried to make it quite accessible in terms of some level of prescriptive advice and guidance. But there again, it still is a challenge for those organizations in terms of the balance of time, and in terms of the amount of time they have to focus on their core business versus versus these types of activities, and also then just level of technical awareness perhaps as well.
And that's a very difficult question to answer, right? Because, when you're a small business, all you're targeting its profits and customers, right? So you really not worry about tech or security or data protection and things like that. So until someone, which when I say someone, until something bad happens to you, or you are forced to do ABC, for example, get certification to Cyber Essentials, or align with the NIST cybersecurity framework, or something along those lines. Usually, in my experience, these organizations will never take a step forward because it is hard and sometimes it's actually expensive as well.
In some ways, if I think back to sort of 10, 15 years ago, a lot of the organizations that I was working with were very driven by compliance requirements and regulations. Certainly 15 years ago, there wasn't really the drive around cybersecurity, and I'm talking about upper mid market, so the medium organizations into the large organizations. So I do think the general awareness of things like scams has increased, and how people can be subject to some form of online attack. Literally earlier on today, I had a smishing attack from someone purporting to be my CEO. That was quite entertaining for a couple of minutes. But yeah, I mean, I think to JC's point, unfortunately, when people become really aware of it after they've been subjected to this type of incident, it can often be too late. And in the work context of SME, too late can have some devastating consequences for the overall business when we talk about the margins that they could be operating in and the disruption to their cash flow and their profitability.
That is very true.
Add as well, following JC's comments about obviously the cost as well can be quite daunting for a lot of small businesses, especially when they just start putting their feelers out there to what's on offer. It can be information overload in terms of controls and information what they should be passing down to staff as well. But the police initiatives, the cyber resilience centres are a really good place to start as well for having digestible information, but also services that are at much lower cost as well. So it's nice to see that there is sort of that small business push really after seeing what devastating effects it has. The police are getting these reports saying I'm a small business owner, I've suffered this attack. It's around 80% of small businesses can go under as a result of attack. So it's really good that these initiatives are taking place. It's just such a slow large ship to steer, isn't it, really? Because there are so many businesses out there to reach.
And it's a fairly complex environment to understand, right? There's no doubt about that. It's not this isn't an easy thing to implement, which is to your point, Stephanie, about there are resources out there, but they can sometimes be really quite overwhelming, the sheer volume of them, or even how to interpret them, and perhaps more importantly, put them into place in your 9-person, 12-person, 20-person organization.
Very true. Very, very hard problem to resolve. And funny enough, recently I had a friend of mine who is trying to become a cybersecurity specialist, and I was having a conversation with his mother and family and parents, and they all were talking about the CrowdStrike issue and how did it happen, and for a moment I was happy that people who would never ever hear about such a thing, technology, cyber attack, they are actually talking about it and asking me these questions. But at the same time, this is the level that they can go. Oh yeah, we heard about this. It's important, but we don't really want to talk about it anymore. That's it. That's all we want.
It wasn't my flight that was cancelled, and it only meant I couldn't buy anything from the shops for an hour or two, so I just did something else. There was no, how can I put it, no material impact on the average person.
Exactly. And this is the same thing that happens with a small business. I have worked for a small business as a consultant, also internally. And, sometimes they just don't want to take that step. Hey, you haven't affected me as of yet, so I'll just do the minimum as possible. And sometimes I really will not do anything. I will ask the IT guy to do it, but if the IT guy does, it's okay. But if the IT guy doesn't do, there's no one there to, to audit that or to make sure,
Yeah.
someone is doing something.
I mean, that would certainly chime with some of the findings we've had from our research, talking to SMEs and also talking to providers of support for them. Certainly the providers give the impression that the trigger for SMEs contacting them, it's not general interest in cybersecurity or having heard something. It's they've had an incident and they now need somebody to help them. The horse has already bolted, so to speak. And similarly, talking to the SMEs themselves, the sort of sentiments you were saying there, JC, about, well, we prefer not to think of it. We've got other pressures, and quite legitimately, they've got other concerns, resourcing, etc. And so it's not front of mind. But yeah, the very point is that when it becomes front of mind, it's for the wrong reasons at that point. And the situation is far more dire than perhaps it could have been.
Exactly.
So, Stephanie, I want to pick up on something you also mentioned yesterday about for SMEs actually building a culture, which I mean is challenging enough generally, but certainly in a small to medium sized organization that doesn't have a dedicated focus on this, is to JC's point, focused on customers and profit, sales, etc. Why would a culture be really important here?
Yeah, so I think from my experience with working in small businesses and engaging with them on cybersecurity, I think sometimes as well it's quite a fear. It's a fear of the unknown, like, oh gosh, if I click a link, is this going to happen? And if I do something wrong, I can't really own up to it because what are the consequences? So I think when there's a culture of fear around like the bad guys out there, it's quite difficult then to sort of like confidently feel that your staff are actually going to actually prevent an attack, really, because you don't really know where they're standing on it and what their understanding is. So I think just sort of bringing it more to life and dedicating some time around awareness is really important. So there's lots of ways you could approach it, and it all depends on, I guess, like who's working for you, what really resonates with them, and how does it relate to the work. As we talked about, people in retail, they're obviously very busy trying to sell stuff, making a profit. So what's really going to actually hit home to them about, well, if I need to make sure that I'm using a unique password that's 12 characters long for this account and implementing two-factor authentication, because all these steps are really going to protect my work essentially. But it's how do you make that relevant to them? And I'm quite passionate about making sure that, depending what your budget is or how much time that you're dedicating to awareness, is actually bringing some fun into it as well.
Yeah.
So if you are a small business and you don't have much resource, think about what resonates with your team. Have you got a team that really let's say what's popular at the minute, celebrity, get me out of here. Have you got a team that are chatting about that all day, like they're really into it? Why not set up a small game that talks about relevant characters in that, and about, how that security could take place? You got to get someone out of the jungle, or, just make it relevant so they're actually listening to it. And they're thinking, actually, yeah, I'm interested in this topic. It's not scary, really, if I do the right things.
Yeah.
That's valid even for larger organizations, insofar as you see cybersecurity training often being entered into as a tick box exercise just to show that it's been done, and whether the effect of it, it might have raised awareness in a very transient way, but whether somebody's emerged from it actually behaving differently, even knowing more that's going to stick with them, is perhaps unlikely. So the whole engaging with the user community, I think, applies across the range of organization sizes.
And if somebody does click on a phishing link, then they have to eat a kangaroo's unmentionables.
I think if they do, they need to be confident to own up, tell the right person, so action can be taken place. And I think that's the worry, isn't it? that if the mistakes will happen, phishing emails are designed to make you click on them. We've got AI now, they're just going to get more and more efficient, looking more authentic. We really need people to obviously be watching out for the telltale signs, but if a mistake happens, to know they have to report it quickly and know that they're going to be supported as a result. I think that's really, really essential for any organization.
So, Steph, do you think the culture stems from appointing somebody that's got some level of directorial leadership around it, even in a sort of medium-sized organization, somebody that's leadership position that's on point to consider all of these cybersecurity related matters? Do you think that helps, or
Yeah,
is
I
that...
mean, it always helps having leadership on board, doesn't it, from any sort of point of view, I guess. But yeah, essentially, if you've got a culture again that's not really into this topic, not really like building support networks, not having good processes when incidents do happen, then it's really hard then to expect your staff to be doing the right things and to confidently know when they're doing mistakes as well.
It's that thing of someone somewhere in the organization, however big or small, has to care enough about it. And the more senior they are, the better. But to the point you've just made, Stephanie, and reinforced by Stephen as well, is that actually you don't need a major security functional program to have an improved cybersecurity capability in your organization. You just need, dare I say, a spirit of openness and transparency and honesty, and one that encourages learning, potentially from mistakes, but hopefully not.
I think to that point, Tom, I mean, those characteristics that you've defined are so true across so many other disciplines and not just necessarily, wholly restricted to cybersecurity. I do think as organizations seek to grow and seek to build themselves from micro through to assuming that this is what they want to do and they're not just a lifestyle business, of course, but if it's micro, then into, small and sort of into medium as they scale up and they have ambitions to growth, being able to proactively think about this is only going to stand them in a better stead moving forward. And culture is important. I think we all recognize that. We all seem to be in violent agreement that culture is important. Leadership, having somebody on point that has some level of focus on this area of risk to the business is also important. I do think it's a combination. It's a classic combination of people, process, and technology.
Yes.
I think having those elements in place, and there's items that, of course, sit within each of those areas, but having that mix of those areas is going to be really crucial for organizations to at least be able to get to a position of a tolerable risk profile for them.
Mm.
So,
And I think it's interesting that people is the first one of those three, and that's the smaller you are, that's probably the most important one for you.
I think it's the most important one, almost, irrespective of the size of the organization, because at the end of the day, it tends to be people that are entry points into the organization. Phishing still remains, a favored tactic for adversaries to trick people into getting into the organization. And of course, it's people that can unwittingly make mistakes and expose an organization to some level of incident that turns into a breach. I do think whilst clearly there's technology advances that are being leveraged by organized criminal gangs and by certain other threat actors, there is an opportunity for technology to really help organizations that are resource strapped. Steph's already mentioned about AI being utilized as a mechanism to improve the level of authenticity associated with phishing campaigns. But equally, the same can be said of applying particularly generative AI into organizations to, help an individual that perhaps is not specifically security trained, but to give them some capacity to be able to understand what the information's telling them in relation to the potential that they may be facing a cyber attack, to give them that context. So, those advances I think are really important for organizations to understand and can help them.
I think there's also an element of SMEs needing to be realistic in terms of where they set the targets for what they want to achieve with cybersecurity. So, I mean, we've had Cyber Essentials mentioned a couple of times already, but that even something like that, which in many contexts would be regarded as a baseline thing to achieve, is going to be beyond the immediate capability of an SME to do. And maybe micro organizations might in particular sort of say, but how does that relate to us? And perhaps on the smaller end of the scale, I mean, going back to the people point, having smaller targets, sort of, are all the members of the organization in our, essentially small team versed enough in basic cyber hygiene, the sort of cyber aware principles, for example, NCSC would promote from their site, because that, even taking those sort of steps, having people understand those very basic things that they don't just need to know in the context of the business, it benefits them in their wider use of technology, but ensuring everybody's at that level would be a fundamental contribution to keeping the organization safer than it otherwise might be.
And to just move on to this last point here about strengthening cyber resilience with incident response playbooks. Years ago, I remember asking a question. I think it was at the launch of, I can't remember, is it ISO 22301, the business continuity standard, one of them anyway. And I actually asked the question of, should a small organization have a business continuity plan from day one? And the answer was no, probably not. It's just not effective. It's, there's no expertise to write it. There's no, there's nothing that you won't be able to bring anything to the table. And I think, response playbooks are often touted as a great way to address something you don't know much about, because it's a framework. But even creating a basic one in the first place is, I would say, virtually impossible for the micro and some of the small organizations.
I think in terms of a micro organization, one of the things about playbooks, of course, is the orchestration and the orchestration across teams and automation. Whether an organization that's only got a handful of people actually needs that level of capability is perhaps, questionable and debatable. But as organizations certainly scale up into the medium size, I think there are advantages in having some form of automated capability that can be delivered to reduce the time it takes to both detect some form of malicious activity, but also then respond to that malicious activity. And in an organization that's, not a very large bank or a hyperscaler, where they really don't have dozens and dozens or hundreds of people within information security, being able to leverage a technology that can provide that level of detection efficacy, automate it into some kind of response, can be a real benefit to those organizations. Now, there's always going to be a tipping point in these scenarios as to when that makes sense for the organization. I would advocate, certainly to try and do it as early as possible in the life cycle of the actual business and organization, so that they start to think about this. And it isn't even so much from a cybersecurity standpoint, it's more from a resilience standpoint. And to your point from a business continuity, because it does come back to, revenues, and it comes back to profits, and it comes back to the impact on the business if something does happen. So that's how I would encourage business owners in that sort of medium space of SME to really start to think about the leveraging of technology.
It's the revenue protection plan.
Well, that's a great way of describing it, Tom.
Yeah,
I think you should trademark that, Tom.
You can have that, Kev. It's a pound.
Thanks.
But this is true. I think, and it sounds slightly odd to say so, but it sounds like all of these, TLAs, these three-letter acronyms that we throw around in these sort of medium and large enterprises and all that sort of, is they're all valid and they all are there for a good reason, etc. But when you try and translate it down to brass tacks, as it were, to your 10-person organization, to your 20-person organization, it's bewildering and overwhelming. And there needs to be almost like either a translation guide or a simplification of that, to the point about revenue protection plan, right? That actually probably speaks more to a micro organization than business continuity plan or business continuity management or whatever. I mean, are there resources out there that will do that sort of thing? Or should we all just get together and build a company?
I've consulted for very small micro organizations, and I don't believe so. Focused to 100% to very micro small organizations. Again, I might be incorrect. I know it's impossible for me to know every single resource on the internet, but from my experience, I have not identified a resource which is extremely simple, extremely easy to digest, and it will fit for a very micro and small organization and talk in a language that they actually understand.
I mean, I think the closest is probably Cyber Essentials, to be honest with you.
Exactly, and as of Stephen have highlighted, it's still quite a walk to
Yeah,
get that
it's a lot of effort. It's a lot of effort.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we're coming up on time. As usual, we give everybody, each of you, a chance to give some of your wonderful advice to our audience, and we like to keep it practical. So the question is, as usual, what should our audience members do when they get to their desks tomorrow morning? I'm going to start in the order that I can see on my screen. So let me start with Stephen. You've got about 15 seconds.
Okay, so I think if you're an SME, particularly on the smaller side of things, one thing you could usefully do is take a look at the National Cybersecurity Centre's Small Business Guide for Cybersecurity. Take a look through that and see if you feel comfortable that you've got the bases covered.
Yeah, very good. Very good. Steph.
Can get myself off mute then. Yeah, so following Stephen's comment, yeah, I think that's an excellent first step. And then I would think, what do staff really need to know based on what like online activity they have, what they're logging into? And then if you've got any creatives in the business, turn to them for some advice about how you can turn this topic into an interesting one for your colleagues.
That may or may not involve kangaroo unmentionables.
Or
Okay.
open to any.
Very good. Very good. JC.
Ask the question, what are the processes, technologies, and people that generate revenue to your organization? If you're able to put all of that in a piece of paper and link those together, there we go. You have the answer of the things you should watch, protect, and take care of.
Nice. Like it. And finally, Kev.
Everything that everybody else has said, plus understand what the early warning signals are in your business that could indicate that you're about to be disrupted, and then that you can do something about it and act on it.
Interesting. Very good. Very good. Stephen, JC, Steph, and Kev, thank you so much for your input and time today. I did neglect to mention that Kev is our sponsor today. So we have Kev to thank you for our teas, coffees, and biscuits, chocolate hobnobs or digestives. Which were they, Steve? Which were they, Kev?
Good question. I don't know.
All of the above.
All of the above. There we go.
All of the above, yeah.
And the pink wafers, because everybody loves a pink wafer. Right, so excellent. Thank you very much. To our audience, I see we had one question from Peter. Peter, my apologies, we didn't get around to it. Hopefully, we kind of addressed it, but it's quite a difficult one, talking about the critical mass of the growing IT and security teams as they scale up. And Peter, I know you've been very good at collecting the mugs, but I think we will need a little bit more before we award this. So I'm going to keep this one, actually. So that's mine this week. And finally, we are back again next week for our fourth and final episode of November, which is on 28th of November, a week today, transforming your security operations to detect and respond to advanced attacks. We've got some lovely guests on there, some returning, some new. So very much looking forward to that. It just leaves me to say thank you once again to Stephen,
Thank you.
JC,
Thank you.
Steph,
Thank you.
and our wonderful sponsor, Kev.
Thank you very much.
And to everyone else, stay secure, my friends.